another episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I'm your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time. This is Liberty Dad versus Mamdani's policies to LGBTQIA plus protections. All right, so what we're going to do is he's got a policy memo. We're going to go through it, and we're just going to point out some things that I think are problematic. So let's read this. Queer and trans people across the United States are facing an increasingly hostile political environment. I actually don't disagree. Now, when it says hostile political environment, what does that mean? Like, are they at risk of being physically harmed? I'm not so convinced that evidence has been presented to show that there's any significant increase in physical harm. That isn't to say it's not happening. Okay, this is what we have to start doing. Whenever you say, I don't think it's increased or it's dramatically increased, somebody always jumps up and they're like, oh yeah? What about this? Oh, what about this incident that happened last week? Okay, your one incident doesn't say this means there's a trend now, much less a sharp trend up. That's not what that means. You would have to go and say, look, DL, in 2015, there was one. In 2016, there were two. And then it remained two for the next several years. And then in 2020, it went up to 5. And this year, we're in the middle of 2025, and now it's up to 30. Okay, that would be a trend upwards and a sharp increase. That's what you have to show. So if somebody disagrees that, hey, I'm not seeing the evidence of a sharp increase or even an increase at all, that's what they're talking about. They're looking for a trend. And if you don't present a trend, right, then you are not presenting an argument. It's a non-argument. All right, but I do agree that it's hostile. Why would I agree to that? Well, there's a lot of legislation being passed in red states. So, yes, it is hostile. It's not meant to be necessarily nice. And it's not just as simple, because I know a lot of red state folk, a lot of red right-wingers, they're going to be like, we're trying to protect the children. Okay, you might argue, there could be an argument that you're not creating a hostile political environment if you only limited it to children or to certain children or certain circumstances, right, with children. But some of the legislation that's been proposed has included adults. Some of the opponents have included adults. As a libertarian, if you want to go and get your nose pierced, you can do that, right? When you're 18. If you want to go stretch out your nose, you can legally do that. I will support your legal right to do that. I may tell you it's unwise, but I support your right to do that. As an adult, if you want to cut off body parts, I'm going to really tell you that's probably a bad idea. However, you are a legal adult, and if you go through a proper process, you should be legally allowed to do these kind of things. Why? Because it kind of happens already anyway. People go in and they have something removed that's causing them problems. Now, normally, that something removed that's causing them problems is something that is, physical and tangible. Like you can look at it and you can be like, hey, we had to remove this lung because your lung, was doing this thing and it was damaged and it was causing you problems, And so we had to remove sections of your liver because, we were cutting out the cancer. And so we had to get rid of some of your liver, right? So yes, removing body parts is sometimes something that happens. Do I support the idea of removing body parts that are otherwise healthy? Generally speaking, I don't. But again, if you want to go, for me, I look at it like this. If you're an adult and you want to go get a boob job, okay, well, you're adding stuff to a perfectly healthy body. So it seems reasonable to me that if you want to make the decision to have them removed, you can. And by the way, some women do have breast reductions, right? So it's not the case that we never, ever remove healthy tissue or healthy body parts. Sometimes we do. I'm not going to try to list them all here, but there are edge cases. And the fact of the reality is trans folk are edge cases. They are. There's not that many of you. And not all of you necessarily want to get surgery. So it is an edge case. And so if you want to wait till you're an adult and then finally make a decision, I'm on board with that. Like, legally speaking. I might not agree with it, But it's, like there's that what is his name? Uncle no. I want to say Uncle Buck, but that's not it. But he's the famous trans man. By the way, never look up his name. I Google searched it one time and I was like, whoops, that was a mistake. Because I didn't realize that he was a porn star beforehand. So it's like a man from halfway up. And when I say man, I mean he looked like a burly man. Like he looked like a man that might go out and work construction. Huge forearms, just gruff looking face, beard, like straight up looking like a tough dude. Okay. But then, unfortunately, I did see the lower half and not a dude at all. So, anyway, but I support his right to go through and do the changes to his body. Same as I would if somebody said, I'm going to tattoo my entire body black, which some people have, or I'm going to get body modification. I'm going to have my teeth sharpened so that I look like a vampire. Or maybe they're like, hey, I'm going to get my eyeball tatted, which I think is a bad idea. But hey, it's your body. And if you want to take that risk, you can as an adult. Okay? Let's go on to what he says here. New York City must be a refuge for LGBTQIA plus people, but private institutions in our own city have already started capitulating to Trump's assault on trans rights. Okay, I find this word capitulating interesting. We're going to dig into that. Meanwhile, the cost of living crisis confronting working class people across the city hits the LGBTQIA plus community particularly hard, with higher rates of unemployment and homelessness than the rest of the city. The Mamdani administration will protect LGBTQIA plus New Yorkers by expanding and protecting gender-affirming care citywide, making New York City an LGBTQI plus sanctuary city and creating the Office of LGBTQIA plus Affairs. Read our policy memo here. Well, we're going to get into that policy memo. But I will say this. If we look over here at Politico, because you might be, if you're a libertarian, if you're somebody that doesn't support Democrats, if you're somebody that's opposed to liberals and socialists, you might be like, why are you talking about him? Well, he is getting popular, as are his ideas. Zohran dominates in a new poll. Let me read these first two paragraphs here. Democratic mayoral nominee Zohran Mamdani looks to be cruising toward victory, capturing 50% of the vote. 50%. In a new general election poll, the mayor's race paid for by his allies. Now, yeah, I get it. Like how legitimate is it? Okay, but here's the thing. In the five-way contest, Andrew Cuomo trailed him with 22%. Now, let's say he's fudging the numbers a little bit. Like he paid somebody and they're like hooking him up with some better numbers. Like unless they're outright just making stuff up, like even if they fudge him, he's still winning. 22%. Republican nominee Curtis Sliwa came in third at 13%, and Mayor Eric Adams captured 7% of the vote among likely voters. Attorney Jim Walden received 1%. Is he a libertarian? Like, because that sounds about like libertarian level. He probably isn't. But I think that we should talk about it because we should talk about these ideas. Now, and like I said earlier, I'm not afraid of this, oh no, socialist communist. I don't go freak out and be like, socialist commie, run, Red Scare, call McCartney, McCarthy. Like, I don't get that. I'm just like, all right, let's talk about your ideas. Let's break them down. Let's see if I agree with them. Because sometimes I agree with the sentiment, but not necessarily the ideas in terms of policy. And that's because I'm libertarian and, well, good luck finding policy that I'm going to support. I do support it. Just supported Thomas Massey, right? And not just because I want to jab at the no pun intended, because I want to jab at the pharmaceutical companies. It's not why. I just think that you should have the right to redress. And if somebody has harmed you, you should be able to get compensation from them. That's it. That's simple. It doesn't matter whether it's your neighbor or the pharmaceutical company, right? So there are legislation. And look, I tell you guys at the beginning of the show that I'm the most objective libertarian. Let me just prove it to you. I did an episode. Which episode was it? I'm gonna look at it. It was where is it here? I did a 2-part series. Okay, so I did Randy Fine, who like nobody likes. Even AIPAC is like coming out and denouncing him. Okay, like you know how bad of a Jewish politician you got to be for AIPAC, to come out against you. You got to be pretty bad. He's a vile person. So I did a 2-part series on his first 100 days, and I reviewed 8 of his bills, 4 in each show. I believe I supported 3 of them and opposed 5. 3 of them. And I was like, yeah, that's not so bad. Okay? So and I don't like that man. Like, if I could get him unseated, if I could, like, help out a candidate to unseat him or get a recall or something like that, if I could, I'm not in his district. But if I could in some way assist, I would do it today. I would stay up late helping because I despise that man. I think he's a vile, wicked man. But I'm the most objective libertarian in America. So therefore, I have to be earnest and forthright. And I have to come, to the table and say, sometimes I agree with this, sometimes I don't agree with this, right? Same thing with Mamdani. Yeah, he's a socialist. I think socialism doesn't work. It's a precursor to communism. Both of them have a long history of failures, right? So do I support him on it just in general? No, not at all. But I am going to evaluate his stuff fairly. Just like I told you, I think that politically, yes, the LGBTQIA, whatever, the alphabet mob, I think that there is increased hostility in politics, right? Because we're seeing legislation. A lot of that legislation, even though I may agree with the sentiment, I might actually disagree with that legislation. Maybe it was written poorly. Maybe I think it went too far, whatever. Like, if you say, hey, we should stop, if you want to put it into law that we cannot do surgeries to chop off, sexual body parts of children, I'm going to agree. Okay? But if you extend that and say, yeah, also adults, I'm going to be like, well, no. I'm going to keep with everything else. I'm going to say adults, they should have the same decision to make bad decisions as they do in every other facet of life that I already support. So I'm going to be consistent. All right, back to Mamdani here. So I think it's worth talking about. Now, I will say this. Here's an interesting video we're going to play. In this video, this is Representative Laura Gillen. She's out of New York District 4, so she's a congresswoman. So she's not in New York City. But it seems that even the Democrats aren't a big fan of Mamdani. So let's listen to hear what she has to say. Or maybe. Did I get it? Did I not add it? You kids. What did I not export it? Oh, wrong. There it goes.
So let's talk now about politics. New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani was in Washington to meet with Democratic lawmakers last week. Have you met with him yet? And do you still believe that he's too extreme to lead New York City?
I have not met with Mr. Mamdani, and I don't agree with Mr. Mamdani's policies. I do not think that cratering the New York City economy will be good for my constituents. My constituents work in New York City. Their kids live in New York City. And the policies that he is threatening to saddle New York City with will crater our economy. And
I think that's kind of funny. She's like, he's threatening. I don't know that I like that phrasing. Like, I don't think he's threatening policies. He's not like, we're going to do this policy and destroy you. Vote me. Like, that's not really how it's happening. But it's an interesting choice of words. And she is a Democrat. This is Laura Gillen. She's out of New York District 4. That's not in New York City, but it's a wealthy area to the east. And when you're talking about a wealthy area, what do people with money do? They use that money in their network to influence things. So I think it's worth hearing what she has to say because she could be getting... Now, I'm assuming that since she's not challenging him, that she is representing her district and she's hearing from them and they're like, yeah, we don't like these ideas. You got to come out and be against it.
it will have reverberating effects across New York State.
But New York City voters have to pick someone, right? So if it's not Mamdani, who the Democratic voters in New York City picked, who is it? Is it Andrew Cuomo? Is it the current mayor, Eric Adams?
The field is still emerging. We'll see who is left standing on Election Day.
But you don't have a preference right now?
I don't vote in New York City, but the reason I'm getting involved and weighing in is because I believe that Zohran Mamdani is a threat to my constituents. He is not the right face for the Democratic Party. We are a party where I believe we should lead from the middle and lead from a centrist position.
So that's kind of interesting because, look, I want to point something out. I have been noticing that some Democrats have been walking back toward a more centrist position when they weren't there to begin with. So I'm not going to I'm not going to name any names. There's a guy, he even here in Jacksonville, he surprised me when he came out against trans athletes playing in women's sports. And he took a lot of heat for it. Now, I happen to think he's correct, and I don't recall his positions beforehand, but as far as not like an explicit post where he was like, hey, I'm all for it. But I'm pretty sure I remember seeing him support this. And then now he's not. And then I've seen some other things where I'm like, that's an interesting take. I didn't realize. So I think what's happening, I think some Democrats are starting to realize that the writing is on the wall. If they let the extreme people in the Democratic Party win, then they're going to start losing badly, like even worse than they already have. So I think they're recognizing we better find our way back to the middle, okay? And that's important because if we don't talk about Mamdani's policies, we don't talk about all these other things, then they get to set the narrative on why they're backtracking. But I can set the narrative and say, hey, this guy's part of you. He is part of your club. And he actually believes many things that you believe, just he takes them to their end conclusion. You do not. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind.
Common sense ideas and concrete policies that can actually lower the cost of living for everyday Americans. And Mr. Mamdani's policies are all smoke and mirrors. He does not have the authority to do half the things he says he's going to, and it would have very bad economic effects on New York that will be passed down to the middle class and to working class folks.
So she makes an interesting point there. She said he doesn't have the authority to do half of them. So far, in some of the housing and especially in the safety video, I actually went through some things, and it's very questionable whether or not he could do it as the mayor. So, for instance, in the housing one that stands out was rent freezes. He can't really promise rent freezes because rent is overseen by a board. Now, he appoints people, and presumably he could let some people go when their term comes due, and he could appoint people that he thinks will do his bidding, but it's always possible that they don't. And as far as I know, he doesn't really have the weight to impose any repercussions for them not doing so. So therefore, he basically doesn't have any leverage to ensure that they do, and he doesn't have the power himself. So I'm not so sure that he can actually promise it and deliver on it. But, we're walking through it anyway, and at least one Democrat already agrees with me to some degree.
Okay, to that end, though, I want to put up a statement from Dan Pfeiffer, who worked for President Obama. He said, if a more moderate Democrat beats a progressive in the 2028 primary, as in 2016 and in 2020, it will be tough to convince progressives to unite behind the nominee when the Democratic establishment won't rally behind Zohran Mamdani after his convincing primary win. At some point, don't Democrats have to come together, even if you don't agree on every single issue?
Her answer here isn't really about Mamdani so much, but it is. But just listen. I think it's very interesting.
I think in 2028, progressives will not unite to go support a Republican.
What? He didn't ask that. He's like, look, don't you kind of got to rally around your guy? Because if you don't, you could lose. And she's like, we don't support Republicans. Well, duh. You're the Democrat Party. Of course you don't. I mean, I could have told you that before you ever got up here. I didn't need to see you. I could have just guessed in my sleep and got it right. That's just an absurd answer. I think she doesn't want to answer the truth, which is, yeah, we kind of do because we have no other plan otherwise.
And so but is that enough? So what's going to happen in New York City then? Is Curtis Sliwa going to win in New York City? I mean, someone has to pick someone in this race, right?
If I could tell you who's going to win elections, I would be a great soothsayer. I don't know who's going to win.
Okay. This is the problem with politicians. This is why we should be so harsh on them and bully them all the time. Nobody asked her to tell the future. He said he wants to know, who do you support, and shouldn't the Democrat Party kind of rally around people that are making progress in their runs? We just read that Mamdani is around 50% for his primary, right? That's a hell of a lot. It looks like he's going to win the primary, and he's going to be the Democratic nominee for mayor. And so he's like, well, shouldn't you support him? And she doesn't want to answer because she knows that they're going to have to, probably. Otherwise, who knows what'll happen.
In this election, I know what my policy is, and my policy is I do not support Zohran Mamdani in this election. And I do believe 100% that the Democratic nominee for president in 2028 should be a centrist, moderate, common sense Democrat, because that's where the majority of Americans are, not on the fringes.
Okay, that's all good and well, but he's not talking about 28. He's talking about, Zohran Mamdani. Do you support him or not? And you should be supporting him, like in a sense. Or you should have put up a better candidate the moment he got in. See, here's the problem with politics. Along comes somebody like Zohran Mamdani. I've watched his videos. Dude is charismatic. He is appealing. He's a young guy. He kind of has, he's like the male version of AOC. Remember how she hit the scene and people were like underestimating her? But she just went and knocked doors and she was like, yo, I'm running for office. And she kind of had an appeal to her. She had a pretty face, nice smile. And, we can say this. I don't have to be, just because I oppose virtually everything legislatively doesn't mean I have to be like, oh, she was ugly and terrible and ran a bad campaign. Clearly she didn't. Clearly she's not ugly, right? She got the attention of voters for this new person coming in who had no record, right? The reality is we are somewhat attracted to attractive people. We're not exactly hiring or voting for the ugliest person on the ballot. We're just not. I mean, and it's not always the prettiest necessarily, but that helps. If we're going to be honest, that does help. So when you're a newcomer, all these things are just a little bit of an advantage to you. And I think they underestimated him, and then now he's got him in a pickle. I don't know. We'll see. But let's get back to Mamdani and his policy. Let's see. And what? I think, did I want to say one more thing about this? Not yet. That'll be in a minute. So let's pull up his policy memo. Let's take a look at it. All right. We're going to get his policy. No, that's not his policy. This one is. All right. So, bam. There we are. All right. So here's his policy. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's 6 pages. I'm not like, you don't want me to read the whole thing. You can read it yourself. It's on his website. But I'll read enough of it. All right. Queer and trans people across the United States are facing an increasingly hostile political environment. Okay. We've already established that. I kind of agree, politically speaking. Not so convinced that there's a physical, tangible violence that's necessarily increasing. Again, not to say it isn't happening at all. New York City must be a refuge for LGBTQI plus people, but private institutions in our own city have already started capitulating to Trump's assault on trans rights. But have they? Have they capitulated? We'll see. So what he wants to do, he wants to expanding and protecting gender-affirming care citywide. He's got 3 bullet points here. The Mamdani administration will protect alphabet New Yorkers by expanding and protecting gender-affirming care citywide. Number 2, making New York City an LGBTQIA plus sanctuary city. I don't know why sanctuary cities are all the rage today, but whatever. And then 3rd, creating the Office of LGBTQIA plus affairs. Okay, let's look at the first one. Expand and protect gender-affirming care citywide. A private institution operating with a $250 million public subsidy, it's $250 million, should not have that $250 million is going to come in important in just a moment, should not have the ability to sell out young trans New Yorkers to the Trump administration. Sell out. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Yet, that's exactly what happened when NYU Langone, I should have looked up how to say it, decided to stop providing gender-affirming care for trans youth. Soon after, other private New York City hospitals also stopped providing necessary life-saving health care for trans youth. Necessary life-saving health care is debatable. I know people love to throw around, would you rather to have would you rather a daughter or a dead son, right? That's what they'll usually say, something like that. That's just emotional manipulation, okay? It's not a guarantee that if somebody doesn't get this very specific treatment that they're going to kill themselves. It's also not a guarantee that there isn't some other alternative therapy that you can offer somebody. That's a conversation that we generally don't have. We don't talk about what are the alternative therapies, what are the alternative options that don't require pharmaceuticals and surgery. We don't seem to want to talk about those as if they don't exist. Like somehow the only way that somebody's going to be able to carry on their life is by getting this surgery or by getting this pharmaceutical. Well, I'm not so convinced. It's not the case with any other pharmaceutical, right? Unless you can test it with an instrument that's calibrated. Like you might say, this person, they have insulin issues. Here are the results from a blood work. Here's the numbers. Here's what we know the numbers should be. Therefore, based on these numbers, we say this person needs this quantity of this pharmaceutical in order to regulate. That I accept, but that's all by the numbers. And we can look at them and we can all agree. And people don't disagree to that. People are like, oh yeah, you got a calibrated instrument that tells you need this, and then you're adjusting the dosage until that instrument delivers the results that you're looking for. Okay, it's kind of like medication for your lipids. You go in and you're like, oh, maybe your blood pressure is too high, or your lipids are too high, your LDL is too high, and so the doctor might put you on some medication to help lower it, right? And then they check it again later, and they're like, all right, these are numbers that I want to see. Okay, that is far different than what we're talking about here. All right, so that's why I kind of question whether or not it's necessary life-saving healthcare, because I feel like there's a lot we can do mentally for people. There's a lot more options. If you're having problems with insulin, you might need insulin. That may literally be your only option. You can't talk that away. You can't do any kind of therapy. You can't go live your life in any other way and change that. I mean, yes, I know you might be able to make some lifestyle changes that would improve it. But what I'm getting at is many of the pharmaceuticals, we have to be careful when we compare pharmaceuticals that we cannot test and validate through instruments that have been calibrated versus ones that can. And so I'm not as willing to say, yeah, necessary life-saving. Anyway, let's continue on. These decisions are in direct contradiction with New York state law. The Mamdani administration will protect gender-affirming care immediately by investing $65 million in public providers to provide gender-affirming care to New Yorkers who seek it, and will hold private entities abetting Trump's attacks to account. Okay, he's got a lot of going on here. Let's unpack it a little bit. Number one, he said this particular hospital stopped providing gender-affirming care. Okay, well, let's take a look. Let's look at how egregious this was, because he wants to make policy, and he wants to change policy for the entire city that affects all of the hospitals. So what's he making policy on? Well, as it turns out, where did it go here? Here's what we know. Here's a New York Times article. I'm not going to read the whole thing. New York hospital stops treating 2 children after Trump's trans care order. 2 children. He's going to spend $65 million for what we know of as 2 children. That's not to say there's more. That's not to say there isn't more. There may be. But this is what came out in the news. Now, this is the New York Times. New York Times is not Trump friendly. So if there had been 14 children, you would have assumed, it's reasonable to assume they would have found them. But they didn't. They reported on 2. The hospital canceled their appointments the same week. An executive order from President Trump threatened to punish doctors and hospitals for offering gender-affirming care. What does it mean by punishing? A leading New York City hospital system has begun canceling appointments for transgender children following President Trump's executive order, threatening to withhold federal funding to hospitals that provide gender-affirming treatments, according to the children's parents. Oh, so his order is like, look, I'll take your money away. And let's look at this. He said they've already started capitulating to Trump's assaults on trans rights. Now, you might believe that these are assaults on trans rights, and that's fine. I'm not going to disagree with you there. That's not the topic of the show. We're talking about Mamdani. But you should at least be a little upset that he's framing this as like they're capitulating, as if like they're just like, you know what? Yeah, maybe Trump's right. We'll just do it his way. But he said, like where did it here? $250 million public subsidy, $250 million. Now, arguably, I would say not all of it would necessarily be lost. It's hard to say. You know, it depends. Trump might say, you know, if these hospitals continued with the care, the Trump administration might say, okay, we're going to cut your funding in these particular areas, but not these other areas that are irrelevant. Or he might say, he might play hardball and cut it all off. You don't know. But let's just say he cuts it all off. $250 million is gone. And then Mamdani's like, we're going to invest $65 million. Anybody notice anything? 65 is far less than 250. Okay? In fact, how much would that be? 250 minus 65, $185 million. Now ask yourself, is it really capitulating if you're like, we can't afford to lose $185 million? Yeah, you're going to get us $65 million, but we have many thousands of other patients that we are treating with this $185 million. Or you could just look at it like the $250 million, because the $65 million is not set in stone. That's what he's promising to do, but it's not a guarantee. He may get into office and may run into trouble getting it. He may not get the support that he needs. He may get less than he wants. Any number of things could happen. So now we have to assume that, number one, the Trump administration will go after them and will prevent them from getting all 250,000 or 250 million. And then we have to assume these are the worst case scenarios, because a hospital should be thinking worst case scenario, right? They don't get $250 million. They also don't get $65 million. So now they're out $250 million that they had over what looks like a handful of patients. So are they really capitulating? Or is it more accurate to say that maybe they got in a bind by being in the position to accept federal funding in the first place? Because when you don't control the funding, you kind of don't control what you do. It's like people that go to a job. I want you to think of an average, everyday, regular Joe, right? We're gonna make this as super simple as possible. Let's say I go to work and I make, let's say I make $100,000 a year. My wife works from home. Let's say my wife stays at home and she takes care of, let's say we have 2 kids, okay? And so then the company comes out with some new policies that I object to. And I say, I don't object. I disagree with this. This is wrong. I shouldn't have to do this, right? Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. And let's say I put up some resistance and the company says, oh, well, in that case, maybe you don't need to work here anymore, okay? And so then I no longer have a job, okay? That's a bit of a problem. Okay, like I'm kind of backed in this corner. I am at the mercy of this company. Now, I'm not making a socialist argument saying, no, you shouldn't be, because the difference between me and this company is that it was at least voluntary to some degree, right? Like I voluntarily got a job there. They voluntarily hired me. With the government has a monopoly on force. Therefore, they can do things out of nowhere that were not expected. They could just be like, hey, we're passing this new policy, and if you don't play ball, we're going to take money from this thing over here. And then people over here might be like, whoa, wait a minute, what do we got to do with that? Right? And in this particular case, the money and the issue are one and the same. It's with a hospital over trans care. But it's not always the case. Sometimes the federal government has been like, oh, be a shame if that federal money for your roads has dried up if you don't implement this other policy that's unrelated to the roads. They have done this kind of a thing. So I would argue in a libertarian society, you would not be reliant on a federal government for your money. So therefore, if a hospital said, we believe it's in the best interest of our patients to treat minors for gender dysphoria, and this is how we want to treat them, if we lived in a libertarian society, you would have less opportunities, far fewer opportunities for somebody to get elected and threaten what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, it's not entirely ruled out, you know, because in a libertarian society, not an anarchist one, but a libertarian one, which is much smaller government, we could say, hey, you know what? Children cannot consent, therefore you cannot give them this particular procedure, right? Like or a certain set of procedures, or maybe some criteria that the procedures have to meet, whatever. Like you could do certain things like that, but it would be less political gamesmanship, which is what we got going on here, right? Like, because when there's funding, you've got patients to worry about. So I think voters should be kind of upset with Mamdani, even if they support him, just for the way that he's framing it. Because they have to, if we're a proper hospital, they're going to have to look out and say, what is that other 185 million or the full 250 million? What is it going to? And what's going to happen if we lose it all? And let's just say we got the 65 million. Okay, that's still not enough. We're 185 million short. And they're going to make an obvious decision. They're going to say it's better for a few patients to have to suffer than many. That's what they're basically going to monetarily, fiscally triage it. That's effectively what they're doing. So I think he was doing that. I think he's saying that in bad faith, and he's probably doing it as a scare tactic. And he's wrong. He should just be like, look, I think this is the way it should be. This is the policy I support. Please vote for me. I will do my best to make this policy come into play. That's what he should do. All right, let's go back to that. All right, we're going to go back to this. All right, so so we saw that. So we'll go down here a little bit more. Let's see. I don't want to read it all. So make NYC an LGBTQIA plus sanctuary city. The Mamdani administration will be committed to protecting the rights of queer and trans New Yorkers from those who have been lifelong residents to those who have just arrived here in search of a place where they can receive medical care and live and thrive without the threat of persecution and bigotry. It will codify these principles by declaring New York City a sanctuary city for LGBTQIA plus people and families. That means, and he goes on, there's actually a little bit better part if we scroll down here. Here's the Mamdani administration will draw on sanctuary city across the country to protect LGBTQ plus New Yorkers and those seeking refuge from anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ plus oppression. So here's what he said. Following legislation from Sacramento and San Francisco, the city will uphold the right to accessible health care, especially gender-affirming and reproductive health care for all city residents. Now, from a libertarian perspective, there is no such thing as a right to health care. Why? Because a right to health care means you have the right to somebody else's labor. I know he's a socialist. He disagrees. I know many of his supporters are socialist. They disagree. But I have no more right to my doctor's labor than you have right to my podcast. You can't force me to say what you want me to say because you don't like what I'm saying, right? You can't say, DL, I like your style, I like your delivery, but I want you to talk about this topic, and you have to. You have no right to that. It's my labor. The best you can do is either support me or not. And if I don't get enough support, then either I continue on or I just bow out gracefully, or maybe not so gracefully. Okay? So I oppose this idea. However, I will say, if you're not in bed with the federal government, it does make this a lot easier for New York to say, hey, here in New York, we're going to do things a certain way. And on that level, I would say, if New York City wanted to do something and they had the furthest that any funding or legislation would go was the boundaries of New York State, then every other state, all 49 states, they could just shut up. I mean, we might talk about it because, you know, it's America. We got freedom of speech. But at the end of the day, they have no vested interest in it, right? Because you don't live there. And now people living in the state, they could make that decision. So it's when you're decoupled from federal government, you can do these things a lot easier. And you can say, yeah. Now, in the case of Sacramento and San Francisco, they've got, you know, a lot of support from their state government, as I imagine New York would, or at least at some level. Okay. But now and again, on one hand, I disagree. You don't have the right to somebody else's labor. But on the other hand, if a state wants to do that, little old me here in Florida would just be like, it would be a much shorter show. Because I wouldn't have to worry too much about it. Like, they do what they do in New York. We do what we do in Florida. And don't get me wrong, I got plenty of gripe with the Republicans too. Anyway, going on. Following legislation from Olympia, Kansas City, Worcester, and Sacramento, the Mamdani administration will ensure that city resources, personnel, and property are not used to persecute prosecute, or detain anyone for seeking or providing gender-affirming care. Now, I actually do agree with this one. This one I'm okay with. Okay? Now, well, okay, let me temper that. I oppose at any level, for any reason, surgical procedures for gender for minors. Period. End of story. After that, I am more willing to let things play out on the free market, because when they play out on the free market, I think you're going to get a lot of pushback. I think you're going to get people who will make a lot of noise, and that offers the balance that we need for whether or not a thing is good or bad. So a lot of people will argue with libertarians, and they'll say, well, you just want to step over dead bodies. No, I think the market would actually create incentives to prevent that in the first place, because nobody's going to want to be associated with the dead bodies. Okay? Back to this. So I do believe that the government should be very, very limited when it prosecutes or detains somebody. I want to see actual crime, actual, victims. And I know a lot of my followers might be like, dude, if somebody's given puberty blockers, they're a victim. Perhaps. Like, for starters, let's be clear. Puberty blockers are not new, and they've been around a while. They are dangerous. You can go look up stories, and you can find out that young kids who were given puberty blockers for things unrelated to gender are now in their adult years, they're dealing with bone issues. Okay? Lupron specifically, I believe. So it's not like this is new. The idea of giving pharmaceuticals to children, even off-label, that is not a new thing. The original purpose of puberty blockers was when a child was going through puberty way too early. And we would say, all right, let's slow it down just a little bit so that it hits when it's typically supposed to. Okay? Nobody argues with that. Nobody says, oh, you shouldn't give puberty blockers for that. Right? And we have data on that. And then there are puberty blockers that are given for other reasons, which I object to as well. Okay? But again, if you look at them, it's not that many. And it's not the case that, okay, if it's only like 5 children, it's okay. What that is to say is it's not an urgency for the government to get involved, because sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. And I think the government has made things worse with this whole transgender issue, whereas when we look at puberty blockers that were given for other reasons, most people aren't really yelling and screaming and saying, oh my God, we got to protect the children. Why? Because so few children are getting these, and then you have to figure out, all right, which children were actually harmed or which children were benefited. And so when you got this tiny, tiny little population getting medication for a particular purpose or pharmaceutical for a particular purpose, and then only one, it's a small group to begin with, and then an even smaller group is actually harmed, well, that's kind of, you can argue and say that's the natural course for pharmaceuticals. And so then we have to look and say, how was the judgment made during this? Did we make good judgment calls and we just earnestly got it wrong? Because I think a lot of people try to do the right thing. A lot of parents try to do the right thing and they get it wrong. And I'm not trying to punish them. So I think in this particular case, I would generically support this. There are some provisions that I would probably not, but just in general, yes. I don't want the government to prosecute or detain anybody that's seeking care. But I also want care to be out in the free market, out in the public court of opinion, so we can debate the issue. And then I think that, where we don't have laws that are fighting for or against it, I think that will help temper the number of children that are being brought and receiving this kind of care. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense to you. Because I think that my view would actually, so if you're a right-winger and you're like, hey, I don't want children, you should look at my view and say, okay, I recognize that DL's view is aimed at getting the fewest number of people for which some of them might find it a value add. And that some will not. The same as we have with any other procedure or or pharmaceutical. And then if you're on the left, hopefully you look at it and you say, okay, I recognize that your position It's aiming to make sure that if somebody does, for some wild reason, there's 8 billion people on the planet, there are nuances somewhere. Out of 8 billion people on the planet, and you look at it and you say, he just wants to make sure that if somebody's receiving a pharmaceutical, any pharmaceutical, that they actually need it. And we're not falling into some craze or whatever. And so we have good, rigorous processes to make sure that somebody gets the proper treatment that they need. And if pharmaceuticals aren't it, if that's deemed not to be the right one, then something else. Talk therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, all kind of things. There's many things that are available out there. Let's go to the next one. Following, Kansas City personnel will not impose administrative penalties on an individual organization for providing, seeking, receiving, or assisting another individual who is seeking gender-affirming care. In general, I agree with this for the same reasons that I just outlined. In my world, I think that you will find far fewer people would be seeking out this health care in the first place. So, I don't want a government imposing penalties of any kind, criminal or civil. Following Olympia in Boston, the city and all taxpayer-funded agencies will not comply or cooperate with legislation or investigations from state or federal governments that threaten the safety or dignity of LGBTQI plus people or aim to strip resources that safeguard their rights. This one I'm a little bit on the fence on. Here's why. When it comes to the federal government, totally support. Absolutely 100%. Like the federal government, I believe they should not have any involvement in this whatsoever. This is city thing, maybe state thing, depending. When it comes to the state and cities, I generally prefer home rule. Now, if a state has said in this state, we believe that the age of consent for medical procedures is, 18, and, you have to, here are these rigorous, we have to investigate any child that's getting a procedure that's under 18. Okay, I might understand that. Again, I'd have to read the law, but I can envision a place where I might be sympathetic to a state law. I don't know. So I'm kind of on the fence, but I do appreciate home rule, which we have here in Florida. So as a rule of thumb, I will kind of like say, I will fall on the side of, yes, I agree, just noting that when it comes to the federal government, completely agree, the state government mostly agree, but there might be a situation where I would say, this particular case, I support the state government over the local one. That's where I am. Following legislation from Olympia, the city will not share information about an individual's sex, gender assigned at birth, or health care with other jurisdictions. Yeah, I'm good with that. Yeah, I'm good. I like the idea of PII, keeping that secure. I don't think the government should be collecting it in the first place. So if they don't collect it, they can't share it. Not a problem, right? Problem solved. All right, last one. Create the NYC, New York City office of LGBTQIA plus affairs. LGBTQIA plus New Yorkers represent at least 15% of the city's population. That's a lot. Now, I'm not saying it's not true. It might be. It's if the alphabet folk have determined that New York City is more to their liking, or San Francisco, then they might move there and say, hey, I like it here. I like what they have to offer. I like the laws that they're passing. I like whatever. So maybe they move there. So it's possible that they have 15%. That is a lot. Just pointing it out. That's not relevant to Mamdani. Like this, it's not a criticism. Just, wow. And they intersect and enrich every community in New York City. Yet they have unique needs that are underfunded and underaddressed. LGBTQIA plus, yeah, I said it right. New Yorkers need to be represented in all aspects of our city. While the Adams administration stripped the funding for the Unity Project, which I'm not familiar with, leaving one person to manage all LGBTQIA plus city programs, the Mamdani administration will create an office of LGBTQIA plus affairs, the office that will expand and centralize the services and support for queer and trans New Yorkers. Here's what it's going to do. oversee and implement LGBTQIA plus initiatives and coordination across all city agencies, community outreach, and education. I mean, okay. This is at the city level. I am much more tolerant about things at the city level, particularly if you're not imposing on somebody else. Now, in this particular case, you're probably going to cost money. It's a taxpayer issue. I would, in that sense, object to it. But if the taxpayers in New York, through our current system, have decided otherwise, then so be it. Expand LGBTQIA plus liaisons to relevant agencies and ensure offices and agencies do not engage in discrimination. Okay, fair. If you have a monopoly on force, you should not be engaging in discrimination, period. However, you shouldn't be getting involved in many things, so therefore you wouldn't have many opportunities to discriminate in the first place. So I think that generally speaking, the city should just stay out, right? Like if it were my city, if it were Jacksonville, I'd say, just stay out. Let the free market take care of it. The free market, believe it or not, the free market can be way more brutal than government and faster. Like, have you ever seen a company, maybe a CEO slips up and says something stupid, and then all of a sudden, like the next 3 days, it goes viral. People are throwing a big fit. Stocks going down. People are getting fired. Like that happens before your legislative bodies even have time to convene and get together and say, what do we do about it? Like all that's already happened. Free market's brutal. So when people are like, oh, the free market's bad, like, no, it's brutal. It'll bury your restaurant and won't even weep a tear. Not a single one. Just keep moving. Ensure nonprofits receive timely dispersals of funds for city contracts. I don't really think that's, I oppose this on the grounds of funding, taken from one person, given to another. But again, this is at the city level. So most of this I'm going to oppose. House legal resources that ensure NYC's LGBTQIA plus sanctuary status is upheld, providing support for trans and LGBTQIA plus people and their families escaping anti-trans oppression. Okay. So if you want to set up a system where people are coming from Florida, where Ron DeSantis is not so, pleasant toward the trans community, and they say, hey, we got to get out of here. That DeSantis guy, he's overbearing. And so then they leave and they go to New York, and then New York's like, hey, we're going to help you get here. We got all these things. Okay. New York City specifically. Okay. Fine. I'm not going to make a big fuss of it. Now, if you want my opinion, they don't belong doing any of that. Because when it comes to minimal government, you don't get much smaller than me. So that's my take on LGBTQIA+. Now, I could go into, he cites this source, and maybe I'll show it just really quickly because I do have it, and I might as well at least present it. So let me put that up on the screen because I thought that was kind of interesting. So he cites this, and let me see where he, So I think it was in his policy memo. Where was it? Because I think I skipped past it. Oh, yeah, where he talks about they're hit with higher rates of unemployment. And so I went to this report because I was just curious. It's over 100 pages, so we're definitely not going to get into it, but I'll just kind of cover it briefly so that you can see it. So here's this 2023 TGNCB employment report. That stands for transgender, gender, nonconforming, and non-binary. I think that's it. Transgender, gender, nonconforming, and non-binary. So this is this 2023 report. So let's go to page 4 really quickly because I'm just going to show you two things real quick that I thought were interesting. So here on page 4, this is written from Governor Kathy Hochul. And she said, in 2022, I signed legislation to help our state better understand the employment experiences of transgender New Yorkers through an effort led by the New York State Department of Labor and the New York State Division of Human Rights on Human Rights. This report is the product of that legislation, and in addition to providing a glimpse into the work lives of TGNCBNB New Yorkers, it charts a path forward on addressing the barriers they face. Okay, so she signed legislation that said, look, you got to go dig in and you got to find information. And then she says, this report is a result of that legislation. Okay, this is why I say you should be skeptical of your government, even if you support some of the ideas that they're telling you. So we go down here, methodology. Seems important, right? Like, why wouldn't you want to know the methodology of a particular report so that you know, is it a good report or is it a bad report? So here's what it says. The department, acknowledges that the people writing this report are not trans experience, and thus prioritized listening to, centering, and amplifying TGNC-NB voices throughout the report development and writing process. Okay, so my first objection here would be like, did they disagree with the findings and manipulate the report to look more favorable or more favorable in the way they would like? I don't know, but I think that's a problem. Either the facts are the facts or they're not. If you say we have 15% of our population is trans or, in this alphabet community, and then you say further 5% of them are trans explicitly, and of that 5% let me rephrase that so it's more accurate. 15% of all the New Yorkers are alphabet folk. Of that 15%, 5 percentage points represent trans folk. And then of that 5 percentage points, let's say that 1 percentage point represents homelessness of the trans folk. Okay, so that would be 1%. I want to make sure I said it correctly so that nobody's like, dude, you're saying it all wrong. You messed me all up. Okay, so you basically end up with 1% of all New Yorkers happen to be unemployed trans folk. I'm making it up. That's not necessarily the numbers. Okay, that is either true or not true. You don't need somebody with a trans experience to say, is that true or not true? And then it's further either true that they got fired for being trans or something about them being trans obstructed them from getting a job. That is either true or not true. Then you can parse it out and say, should the government be involved? Is this a responsibility of the government to do anything about it? So maybe somebody was trying to come to work and they were trying to represent, with flair and stuff. And their job was like, look, here at this company, we can't have people wear all this kind of gear because maybe it's a safety violation. And the person's like, no, I can wear this anyway. I work over here. I know better, blah, blah, blah. And so maybe they want to be, difficult and, engage in some conflict. And so then the company might end up firing him and saying, look, you're just too much trouble to be here. Okay, now they might be unemployed, legitimately so. Because here's the thing. I'm not going to accept the idea that every unemployed alphabet person is unemployed through no fault of their own. If we're supposed to treat them like regular everyday people, which we should, then that means some of them are unemployed through their own issues, through their own fault, their own negligence, something that they did. They need to come to terms with that. That's not a government, that in no way should that be the government's responsibility, ever, under any system, right? The government should be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't just go act like a fool and then fall back on being trans. That's not acceptable, okay? Now, you could make arguments and say, well, here's when, maybe they got fired for being trans. Maybe they showed up to a job. They were presenting as male. They were male, presenting as male, all that good stuff. And then somewhere along the line, they decided that they were female, and now they're presenting as female, and the job fired them, okay? You can have arguments about that all day long if you want, okay? That would be different, right? Especially if the person was doing their best to otherwise comply with all the other rules, okay? Now, I would argue you should still be able to be fired for any reason whatsoever. Part of a longer conversation. Basically, it ends up being freedom of association. I can quit a job for any reason I want. I could quit a job if they hire a black guy. I can be like, oh, with this, I wouldn't do that. That's stupid. But I could. Nobody, and people would just be like, dude, you're dumb. That's stupid, right? And they should say that. And so I extend that on the flip side, and I say, if I marry a black woman, I'm married, so it's not going to happen, but if I were to marry a black woman and my boss hated interracial couples, he should be able to fire me, right? But they should also be able to get the public condemnation and whatever results happen after that. So again, we're back to that free market. That could be brutal. And I could get on a podcast and be like, man, this dude fired me because I married a black woman. That's it. And he told me so. And then the whole world can come down on him. Okay? That's part of the free market. Let's continue. Let's get to the point here. The law calling for this study directs the department to report on data that does not exist. Okay? So they're acknowledging there's no data. It doesn't exist. Okay? We have to create the data. We have to go and get this information because it is not yet available. The department tracks national, state, and local unemployment rates through the Census Bureau's current population survey. This survey does not ask a respondent's gender identity, only their sex, which means there is no option for a respondent to mark if they are trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary, or intersex. As a result, the request to find the employment rate of TGNCNB New Yorkers is not as simple as disaggregating available data. Oh. So, like, where did they get the information? Mamdani is pointing to this report and saying, I'm going to fix the unemployment problem. And it's not even clear what the unemployment problem actually is because they don't have the information. It has not been gathered. All the information that they've gathered, and you can look, it points to different documents like from 2017, 2015, and stuff like that. All those documents aren't useful because what this law asked for, that Kathy Hochul, Governor Hochul, signed into legislation, was you have to acquire this information and develop reports. Not develop reports on information that doesn't exist, so use older information. Go get new information. I will always oppose legislation that is backed up by ignorance of whatever problem they're attempting to solve. The first question I ask when you want to do something is, what problem are you trying to solve? What are you trying to solve? So let me end here on this. I was curious, and I did not fact check all of this, so I'm going to assume it to be true. But I asked AI, I said, can you provide a list of pro-trans legislation passed in New York City between 2020 and 2025? And please give me the count. 11 pieces of legislation or resolutions were passed. Now that seems like a fair amount. Here are some of them. Ordinance to allow X-gender option on birth certificate. Gender X option on death certificates. Bill to implement education programs about intersex individuals. Introduction 246-A mandates X-gender marker on city forms. Introduction 1200-A, public guidance on legal protections in gender-affirming care. Assessment of services for TGNCNBI migrants. I don't know what I stands for. Study on health inequities for TGNCNBI individuals. Support for state bill, personal health information protections. Support for state bill on trans health care standards. Limit out-of-state access to prescription monitoring program data. I probably might support something along that line. I love limiting monitoring from the government or sharing information as much as possible. And then lastly, restricting health information disclosures. Okay, presumably that had something to do with trans. So, like, what is the purpose here? How is he actually going to improve New York? So you have 15% of the population identifies as alphabet folk. Okay, and I don't say that disparagingly. Just a lot easier to say all the letters. And then you've already had all this legislation. Governor Hochul signed legislation, right? Not to say that everything is peachy and hunky-dory, but at what point do you say, it's really up to the citizens, there's no more government can do? When does that moment happen? And if people are flocking to New York City because it's more, the conditions are better, they feel they're better for the alphabet community, then does Mamdani really need to promise anything? Or can he just say, we're going to continue doing what we're doing and supporting the alphabet community, right? And he can use all the letters if he wants. That's my concern. It's always my concern. Because as we advance forward, at least in some areas, I mean, you could argue and say places, red states are being inhospitable. Okay, that's an argument to be made. Good one. I would probably agree. But your blue states, not so much. And I can find law after law after law, legislation, resolutions, whatever, organizations set up for the alphabet community. So at some point, it's time to say, we already have a sanctuary city. Maybe not designated explicitly, but based on the things that we've done over time, we're already there. That's why people keep moving here. That's why we literally have 15% of our population are within that spectrum. So it doesn't make sense to me that he's offering it in the first place. But then when you look at it, I think that Representative Laura Gillen, I think she might be correct that he's over-promising. This should be important even if you agree with these things, because you should not get excited about somebody promising you things that they can't deliver on. You're just going to be let down. And then if you're already in a community where you say, hey, the odds are against us, people are nasty toward us, you know, I have a lot of mental health issues. Is it really helping your mental health issues to have somebody promise to do a bunch of things they can't even do in the first place and then be let down? How's that going to help your mental health? Sounds to me like it just make it worse. So don't do it. Don't support that kind of stuff. Support things that somebody can promise and come and follow through on their promise. Support that. Like if somebody's going for city council, they'll say, I will advance legislation that does this. And you might say, I like that legislation. I have done that before. I have voted for people based on legislation, maybe not legislation, but policy ideas that they wanted to implement that were within the scope of their responsibility, right? Like they could do it. And I'm like, yeah, I would love to see that happen. So yes, I have supported, and I have supported Democrats, Libertarians, and even Republicans. Yes, because I look at it and I say, what are the issues? What are we talking about here? What is the scope of your authority? What can you actually promise? If you're the president and you're like, I'm going to promise that every city is going to be is not a sanctuary city, you can't make that promise. So you shouldn't be making it. And if I think that, you know, if I want the whole United States to be barred from making sanctuary cities, I can't make that. I should not support that guy or gal. And if I do, then I get every bit of the disappointment that's coming my way. So if you don't want to be disappointed, start holding people running for office a little more accountable for what they're promising. Because by the time they get in and then you see what they can't do, it's a little too late. That's my show, folks. Thanks for tuning in.